So, ladies and gentlemen, today on my 2 cents word column, we're going to go way back in the history of domestic terrorism in Canada that led to a death of a Quebec provincial cabinet minister who had connections with the mafia mob and was singled out by the FLQ as part of their ambition to have Quebec as a separate nation using any means necessary. Now, it's well known that the PLO were training FLQ members in terrorism, bombing, and stuff like that. This has happened in Quebec for several years before this happened. But when Pierre Laporte was kidnapped by the FLQ, it had more to do with his connections rather than his importance in the government. They were trying to expose corruption in Quebec to give them momentum for their cause. Now, on the 5th of October 1970, at the start of the October crisis, James Cross, the British Trade Commissioner of Montreal, was kidnapped by the FLQ. Laporte called the Cross kidnapping a wind of madness temporarily blowing across Canada. But 5 days later, on October 10, 1970, he was kidnapped from his home on Robitaille Street in Saint-Lambert, Quebec, by the Chenier cell of the FLQ. The kidnappers, Paul and Jacques Rose, Francis Amand, and Bernard Lortie, approached Laporte while he was playing football with his nephew Claude on his front lawn and forced him into a vehicle at gunpoint. Laporte was chosen partly because of his links to controlling the family, which would embarrass the Bourassa government, and partly because he had no bodyguards, which made him an easy man to kidnap. Laporte was heading towards the street to pick up the football when he was confronted with a masked man who had just gotten out of a car parked in front of his house, who pointed a submachine gun at his face. The FLQ dubbed him the Minister of Unemployment and Assimilation and held him hostage, demanding the release of 23 political prisoners in exchange for his freedom. These were FLQ members that were being arrested by, I think, the federal or provincial government. It was the intention of the FLQ, again backed by the PLO, to have Laporte write out a confession detailing his links to the controlling family, which the FLQ hoped would be the Magna Carta of corruption in Quebec, the English side, of course. Laporte was defiant, telling his captors, "It will all work out, I know it, don't worry, it will all work out perfectly." Laporte was held in the house at 56030 Armstrong, now Beauchamp Street in Longueuil. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked Canada's War Measures Act shortly after, which allowed mass raids and arrests to take place in order to find a group who had kidnapped Laporte and Cross. Now, at the time, there was different cells of the FLQ were not working together, so the Trudeau government was trying to determine which one it was, but a lot of people said that they overstepped their bounds. Now, in published reports at the time, Trudeau said nothing that either the government of Canada or the government of Quebec has done or failed to do now or in the future could possibly excuse any injury to either of these two innocent men. The gun pointed at our heads have FLQ fingers on the trigger. Should any injury result, there is no explanation that would condone the act. Should there be harm done to these men, the government promises unceasing pursuit of those responsible. Now, the Laporte was eventually handcuffed, chained to the floor, and blindfolded. However, by feeling his way around his room and pressing his face across the wall, he was able to discover a nearby window. Now, in the afternoon of October 16, 1970, Laporte heard a police siren in the distance and decided to escape by throwing himself through the window. He broke through it, but his leg chains left him dangling in the air. The broken glass severed his arteries on his left wrists, right thumb, and his chest. As he dangled in the air, Laporte screamed, "Aidez, quelqu'un s'il vous plaît, aidez-moi." Help, help, somebody please help me. But nobody other than his captors heard his cries. His captors then pulled him back in. The police siren that Laporte heard was due to a report of a fire at a house further down Armstrong Street. Over the course of the night, Laporte was bleeding badly from his severed arteries, and it was soon apparent that he would die soon from blood loss if he did not receive prompt medical attention. Simard described him as being like a zombie, saying, "He didn't move, no reaction. We took off his blindfold. He didn't even look at us. It was like Laporte was already dead. It was like somebody stripped of all life. He looked totally empty. You could feel he was already received the death blow." As he was laid out on the floor, Laporte seemed resigned to his death and grew weaker as he refused to speak. On the morning of October 17th, his captors decided to strangle him to death rather than release him to the hospital. 2 men held him in place while a third wrapped a leg chain around his neck, and after a few minutes, Laporte was dead. Now, initial reports, he died when he was going out the window, but he came out with interrogation that he had strangled him. Now, on October 17th, 7 days after he went missing, his body was eventually found in the trunk of a car at Montreal Saint-Hubert Longueuil Airport. Now, we're not sure if the tragically hit song "Locked in the Trunk of the Car" had a lot to do with this incident, but that was a a mafia style to leave a dead person in the trunk of a car. Now, the on the same day, coordinates that Cotroni knew that he was under possession, had given orders for the Cotroni family to find Laporte. Gagnon later stated he was told by compatriots, "Rene, we can't find him. We know where he is." Just minutes after accepting the offer of help from Cotroni's, Gagnon heard the news on the radio of Laporte's murder. Now, he was eventually buried in Cimetière Notre-Dame-de-Neige on October 2070, in a funeral attended by the elites of both Ottawa and Quebec City and Montreal. Now, the Chenier Cell were all arrested by the Sûreté de Quebec on 28 December 1970 at a farmhouse out of Montreal. The members of the Chenier Cell served terms ranging from 20 years of life, though they were all released on parole much earlier. On the 4th of January 1971, Simard, while in the police custody, wrote up in an unsigned statement that noted that he and the two Rose brothers were three men who killed Laporte. Now, in 1977, a book, L'exécution de Pierre Laporte, by the Quebec separatist journalist Pierre Vallier, was published. In his book, he advanced a conspiracy theory that the Canadian Army, the RCMP, and the Cotroni family had conspired to have Laporte murdered and blamed the FLQ, but it was thrown out like crazy. Now, according to published reports by people that discounted that theory, Pierre Laporte was murdered. His death was not accidental. Without entering into details, we have always taken responsibility for the death of Pierre Laporte. From our arrest and the trials that followed, we confirmed our complete responsibility without limitation. Now, a report in Laporte's murder by Justice Duchesne in 1880 concluded that at the very least Jacques Rose and Francis Samar were both present when Laporte was killed, though the report did not name the man who strangled Laporte. In 2010, journalist Guy Gendreau produced a documentary series for Radio Canada in which he asserted that the killing of Pierre was unintentional, saying he was choked in a moment of panic. The journalist Dan McPherson of the Gazette described Gendreau's documentary, which depicted Laporte's murder as more or less an accident, as part of a tendency by Quebec separatists to whitewash the FLQ. Now, when I'm saying that, to whitewash the FLQ, okay, when they started, the PLO was deliberately training them, one of the big operatives, to learn how to make bombs that could be used in post office boxes, the Montreal Stock Exchange, whatever. They panicked and they killed him. Instead of leaving a go or calling up the hospital and saying pick him up, they wanted a martyr, but the thing is, they basically overthought it. Just because he was affiliated with Cotroni, he wasn't going to change the mind about separation. But when you're dealing with terrorists, sometimes we don't know if they were hopped up on drugs or what was going on, but it's all a matter of conjecture. So in 2025, like I said, what Donald Trump said, Canada works better as a state. We have gone through so much shit to keep this country together. We survived 1970. We survived the constitutional talks in 81-82. We survived Oka. We survived Mulrooney. We survived the Meech Lake. We survived the separation vote in 95. We survived a lot of shit. But the idea is, ladies and gentlemen, that Hamas is the PLO. So the grandfather of Hamas is the PLO. So the PLO trained Quebecers to break up our country. So I don't think a fucking cunt like Donald Trump is going to break up our country. We survived the PLO trying to break up our country. By the way, if Donald Trump ever comes to Canada, I'm going to tell you something. He'll be arrested and sent to jail right away. Tell that fucker to cross the border and we'll treat him nice. We'll give him 2.5 craft dinner meals a day, and we'll get a beaver to take care of his foot fungus. He'll chew off his feet. I've never seen a man so stupid as Donald Trump to ignore, and he was in the Montreal Mafia in the 70s. We all know that. That's published reports, because his wife was part of the mafia, the Rizzuto Mafia, as a foot soldier for the Bonanno crime family. He was sent to Canada to learn the mafia trade. Okay? If he was in Canada all those years, he's not known the shit that we've been through. So, ladies and gentlemen, if this is the first time you're hearing about domestic terrorism, by the way, no one's going to be able to comment on this stuff because truth is stranger than fiction. Let Donald Trump cross. I'm asking you a question. If you can tell Donald Trump I want to talk to him, we'll have a debate in public. He'll last 2 seconds with me. You fuck off. That'll be your only conversation. The orange devil, as we call him. Have a good one. Bye.